Please don't shoot the messenger just because you don't like the message. I am not responsible for the conditions that we face as a nation today, but I am not going to sugarcoat what the situation is. My guess is you already know it in your hearts and in the backs of your minds, if not in the front. So I thought it might be useful if we took stock of where we are. And by taking stock, I mean economics above all else. That's a core part of our situation about which Americans are extraordinarily poorly informed. I do believe we are at a major transition point in the history of the United States and probably of the whole world. I know that sounds grandiose, and I don't normally talk in grandiose terms, but the situation calls for it. And as I say, I'm not going to shrink away from why I think this. So let me begin by telling you why I think it's such an important moment in our history. For most of the last 50 years, roughly since 1970, the dominant economic reality of the global economy and of the United States as the major player and shaper of that global economy in the last 50 years, that period can be characterized by many names, but the one that economists use is the phrase neoliberal globalization. And here's what it means: that in an era that we remember with names like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, we turned away from the legacy of the New Deal. We turned away, as did many other countries, from the notion that a catastrophe like the Great Depression of the 1930s required that government play a major role in keeping capitalism tolerable for the mass of people. Remember what we did in the 1930s. We established Social Security that had never existed before in the United States. We established a minimum wage that had never existed before in the United States. We established unemployment insurance that had never existed before in the United States. And the government hired and paid 15 million people who were unemployed, and nothing like that had ever happened in the United States either. The government was called in to do all these things, in the words of one clever thinker, to give capitalism a human face. And it was paid for because it was very expensive, as you can imagine. To give every elderly American a Social Security check every month for the rest of their lives. To give unemployed people a check every week for a year or two. To hire 15 million people. And the money that paid for all of that were heavy taxes placed on corporations and the rich. It's an important reminder for those of you who do not think that here in the United States we can ever tax corporations and the rich. It's an important reminder, of course we can, because we already did. As the remembrance, a footnote, the politician who had the courage to tax corporations and the rich, Franklin Roosevelt, was re-elected president 3 consecutive times. He has been and is to this moment the most successful popular president in the history of the United States, starting with George Washington. So not only can you tax corporations and the rich, but when we had a president who was forced from below to do it, he became the most popular politician we've ever had. In the period starting in 1970, as the memory of the New Deal, as it was called, faded, Reagan and Thatcher undertook to roll the New Deal back. It had already begun before that, but it really gathered steam. And the mantra was the reverse of the New Deal. Instead of calling the government in to give capitalism a human face, people stumbled over one another, led by the Republicans, but tragically followed by the Democrats, to roll the government back, to get the government out of the economy, to go back to a capitalism which, if I may be allowed to continue the metaphor, lacks a human face, as the songs we just heard today document. And over the last 50 years, the government not only didn't regulate the way it once did, didn't intervene the way it once did, but it blessed the decision of corporate America to go where the profits were the greatest, which is what capitalism normally does. And where were profits the greatest? Answer: China. Starting in the 1970s, we had a mammoth exodus, and not like the one in the Bible. No, this was an exodus of American corporate leaders. They had graduated from business school where they had been taught, parentheses, I have taught in business schools myself, I know the curriculum. They were taught, if you want to succeed in business, go to where the wages are low and the market is expanding. The place where the wages were low and the market was expanding the most was in the land called the People's Republic of China. And American corporations, British and French and German and Italian and Japanese, they all went to China, where they were welcomed, where they were celebrated. And over the last 40 to 50 years, the Chinese economy grew. About half the economy there is capitalist. Private companies working pretty much the way they do here. The other half of the Chinese economy, government-owned and operated enterprises working the way they once did in places like the Soviet Union. China is a hybrid between the US and the Soviet Union, different from both because it's a mixed situation. And it turns out that under the leadership of the Chinese Mao Zedong and the ones that have come since him, it turns out this hybrid organization can grow faster than any other economic system the world has ever seen. For the last 30 years, China has grown its economy, its GDP, its gross domestic product, between 6 and 9% per year. During that time, the United States GDP grew between 2 and 3% a year. It doesn't take rocket science to understand that if you can manage that difference, if China can grow 2 to 3 times faster than the United States for 30 years, it can do what it has now done. Namely, it's caught up. Today, the United States has a competitor economically. We haven't had one for a century. World War II eliminated the potential competitors economically of the United States. Britain, France, Italy, Germany, and Japan, all destroyed by that war. Russia too. Russia never was an economic competitor. It isn't now either. The GDP of the United States right now is about $25 trillion. The GDP of Russia about now is 3, maybe 4 trillion. No contest. It never was. It's part of why the entire Cold War will have to be revisited so Americans can finally learn what the truth about all of this is. Well, here we are. And what has happened has been that the United States now faces, for the first time in a century, an economic competitor. Big, powerful, highly developed, and able to outcompete the United States across the board, from the lowest to the highest technology, which either side is capable of. And the United States has not yet come to terms with this situation. The American people are engaged in what my psychotherapist wife explains to me is called denial. The pretense, mostly to yourself, that the reality around you isn't there. It's best understood when glimpsing a toddler confronted by a scary barking dog, and the toddler puts his or her hands in front of her eyes, comforted by the thought that if you can't see the dog, it isn't there. But we all know you grow up, and at a certain point, not many years later, you come to understand you can put your hand there, but it doesn't make the dog disappear. China's going nowhere. China is growing. By the way, lest you think any of this is in the past, let me give you right now what the rate of growth of economic output is for 2024. These I'm about to give you are the estimates of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, which monitors all of this. Economic growth for the United States, 2024, 2.8%, right on target with what it's been on and off for a long time. The economic growth of People's Republic of China this year will be 4.8%, nearly double. And the economic growth of India will be 7%. The next time you hear an American politician or you read in an American newspaper how the American economy is doing better than anyone in the world, please remember the word denial. That kind of statement, which I encounter almost every day, is the exact equivalent of a toddler putting fingers in front of her eyes or nose in hoping that the scary dog will go away. Not only have the Chinese outgrown us, but they have built an alliance with other countries that are recognizing that what was true for the last 75 years, a global economy dominated by the United States as the country that came out of World War II with no bombs that fell on it other than Pearl Harbor, and less damage than any other developed country. The Chinese have built an alliance called the BRICS, B-R-I-C-S. You don't hear as much about it as you ought to. It started a few years ago, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, 5 countries. A year and a half ago, 6 more joined. And 3 weeks ago, 13 more joined. The BRICS together is more than half the population of this planet. The United States is 4.5%, not 50% of this planet. The total output of goods and services in the BRICS is significantly larger already than the total output of the United States and its major allies known as the G7. The United States, Canada, Japan, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy. So now every country in the world, every company in the world is reassessing and redesigning its strategy for the future. And what do I mean? They're redesigning because the dominant player in the world of the last 70 years, the United States, isn't the dominant player anymore. There is a bigger player, richer player in the BRICS, which means if you're going to build a railroad in your country, you don't just go to Washington or London or Paris. You may go to them, but you're going to ask them what offer they can make, and then you're going to compare it to what you can get from Beijing, New Delhi, and Sao Paulo. And in case after case, the choice is made to go with the BRICS, not the West. So what do I mean? I mean to tell you all that if you ask me to tell you what is the biggest reality we now have to face, it's the end of the American empire. What we inherited from the British, because they had the last empire before this one, is now over, and there is zero chance it's coming back. It ought to have been a central issue in the presidential election we just had. Instead, the two candidates and their parties worked overtime to practice denial. No such a thing. The war in Ukraine, just to take one of countless examples, will show you how costly this denial is. When the war begins in February of 2022, President Biden told us, along with all of his officials, Russia would be brought to its knees. The Russian currency, the ruble, would collapse. The entire West would side with Ukraine against the Russian invasion and would defeat the Russians. None of that happened. Every part of that prediction proved false. Why? Because the way Russia was to be brought to its knees was by denying the market for Russian oil and gas, whose export the Russians depend on. It's a major industry for them. And they exported all of that energy to Western Europe. When the Western Europeans, under pressure from the United States, closed their markets to Russia, the expectation was that Russia would collapse. Instead, Russia went to its allies in the BRICS, above all China and India, and arranged to sell to them the oil and gas they no longer sold to the Europeans. As a result, Russia is growing faster this year than the United States, and it has grown at a faster rate than the United States throughout the war. You couldn't be more mistaken than this. That's what it means if you deny a reality. What we know about the history of every other empire that also grew, was powerful, and then died was that the ride up as you're growing is a lot more fun and pleasant than the ride down when you're dying. The ride up was the 20th century, which many of you, like me, lived through. We now have to figure out how we descend when our empire is dying. What the United States is doing is typical. Denial has always been there. You can travel to Britain today and encounter no small number of people who still imagine that the British Empire is still there. Witness the inauguration ceremonies for King Charles, who's the king of nobody. What is this? Here's how it works in the United States. People who are rich and powerful are offloading the costs of a declining empire off of themselves. They don't want to suffer, which I understand. But if the economy is going down, which it is, and the people at the top are keeping theirs, which they are, then the rest of us, the middle class, the lower classes, the poor, we're going to be taking it on the chin more and more. And let me give you just a few of the examples. The inflation we just went through, that's a way of lowering the standard of living of large numbers of people, which they felt acutely as they went and paid $6 for a dozen eggs or everything else. They know they're suffering. My guess, no chance for Mr. Trump without that inflation. It gave him the victory, and it cost Kamala Harris the loss. But it's not the only thing. Let me give you other examples which an economist stares at with astonishment. The minimum wage at the federal level in the United States right now is $7.25 per hour, a sum of money on which nobody can live. When was the last time it was raised? 2009. That's 15 years ago. In every one of those 15 years, inflation raised the prices here in the United States of food, clothing, shelter, and everything else. Some years it went up a lot. Some years it went up only a little, but it went up. And what did we do to the people to whom we paid the lowest salary? $7.25. We didn't raise it. Republicans didn't raise it. Democrats didn't raise it. You know what that is? That's cruel and unusual punishment given to people whose crime is that they're poorly paid in the first place. What kind of a country does that? A declining empire whose rich and powerful are busy offloading the costs of that decline onto everybody else. Here's another sign. Our real wages have been stagnant for 30 to 40 years. In other words, if you measure, as we do in economics, the average wage in dollars paid to American workers, and you adjust that to the prices they have to pay when they spend their wages, it's been going up somewhere around 0.5% a year. That's called stagnation. That means your wage isn't going anywhere. By the way, in contrast, the average real wages in the People's Republic of China have quadrupled over the same 30 years. If you want to understand why the government in China is secure, why it is powerful, why economic growth there is celebrated, I just gave you the statistic. Their average wage quadrupled. The average wage in the United States went nowhere. That's not even close, friends. And if you didn't know that, since everything I'm telling you is easily verifiable in 1,000 government statistics, then you understand what I mean by denial. We are therefore experiencing in this country an extraordinary deepening of inequality. At the end of World War II, the United States was less unequal than European countries. Today, we are more unequal than every European country. How did that happen? Well, on the one hand, when corporations went to China and took advantage of low wages and a growing market, it made a fortune for those corporations and therefore for the top 10% of Americans who own shares. Just a footnote. The top 10% richest Americans own 80% of the stocks and bonds. They did well. The rest of us, we are experiencing a declining empire, which those at the top don't want you to think about. They're managing it quite well. We cannot. That inequality, together with the inflation, gives you Mr. Trump's victory and the bitterness and divisiveness that is suffusing this economy. And still, nobody willing to face these realities or to speak about them. Let me conclude by telling you that this is important to understand not only as our past and not even only as our present, as in the election we just had, but also in our future. This denial, this refusal to face the realities of the economy we have and that is shaping our lives and even more those of our children, promises us frightening near future. Mr. Trump won the election because he positioned himself with dramatic gestures, the sort favored by Madison Avenue advertisers. And the two gestures were, "I am the great protector." Mr. Trump understood far better than the Democrats that people feel attacked, undermined, frightened, scared, worried for themselves and their children, as well they should be. They glimpse fearfully where things are going. They want to be protected from it all. So he put himself forward as the great protector. And his two images were walls, the image of a protector. He's going to put a steel wall at the southern border to protect us against the invasion of the immigrants. And then he's going to put another wall, a tariff wall, to protect us against the evil Chinese. Very powerful images, very successful. But in terms of economics, total incoherent nonsense. It's impossible, and it's a bad joke. And the whole world is watching. And while it's watching this bad joke unfold, the gap between the United States and the G7 on one hand, and the People's Republic of China and the BRICS on the other, deepens. The United States' effort to stop, block, undercut China have failed. Been doing it now for 15 years. Started big time under Obama. It doesn't work. And so the question is, what? Do you keep doing it? When the United States' people wanted to become independent of George III, the dominant king of the great British Empire, it ended up in a war, the War of 1774, 5, and 6, our Independence War. And to the surprise of everybody, the British lost. In 1812, they tried again, and they lost again. After that, the British decided, okay, we'll have to work out an arrangement. And the United States arrangement was, you're independent, you can take Latin America. That was the Monroe Doctrine that happened a few years after that. And Britain took the rest. Asia, Africa was theirs. They avoided a war after that for a century. What will the United States do? Continue its denial of what's going on? Threaten, as they have, China with war, despite the fact that China has nuclear weapons and the Russians do too, and they are now allied in good part because of the United States? Or are we going to sit down and work something out? Are we going to tell the American people, honestly, our empire is declining? The next one looks to be Chinese. Or if it isn't Chinese, it's going to be a multinational replacement for the kind of dominance that the Persians or the Dutch or the British or the Americans operated. The world is changing very fundamentally. We are living, as I said a half hour ago, at a time of enormously profound change. And our job as Americans is to stop behaving childishly in this game of thinking that the problems I've barely sketched don't have to be worried about, because we can continue to act as if we were in charge in the way we were in the 1960s and 70s. We aren't. Nothing like that. The war in Ukraine is lost. For those of you who don't keep track, is over, except for signing the documents. Russia won, Ukraine and the West lost. The war in Gaza isolates the United States. Indeed, what historians will say when they look back on this time will be that the United States undertook to isolate and neutralize the dangers after World War II. First in the Soviet Union, then in China, then in the global socialist world, nowadays in what are euphemistically called authoritarian societies. But the end result of the plan to isolate the rest of the world going through these efforts was to isolate the United States itself. We and Israel are standing all alone in that part of the world. And the Europeans, whose world is collapsed, they're economically a basket case. And you know why? What the major reason is that Europe is gone as a player? Because they relied on two things: exporting to China, which the Chinese don't need, and cheap energy from Russia, which they have turned away from. So the energy costs make European production uncompetitive. They have to pay too much for energy, and they can't sell in China the way they once did. They're done. Germany, which used to be the engine of European growth, is now the laggard dragging it down. It really is extraordinary, folks, that what you have thought about and assumed is now over. And it takes courage, but also a sense of realism to say, now we are going to talk honestly about our situation and try to find a livable way forward. The alternative, well, I don't want to spell it out. You can figure it out for yourself. but I hope you will not hold against me that I have told you how this situation really is, rather than comforting you with more denial.
Thanks for joining us for this Optify deep dive of the segment you just watched.
Yeah,
Richard Wolff really throws down the gauntlet, doesn't he?
he does.
Talking about the American empire potentially declining
Right.
while China and the BRICS nations are gaining power.
Mm.
That's a huge claim.
It is. And what's so fascinating is that Wolff connects this to much bigger historical patterns.
Oh, yeah.
You know, empires rising and falling.
Right.
That's been happening for centuries.
Yeah.
And Wolff's argument is that we might be witnessing one of those shifts right now.
Okay, so let's unpack that a bit.
Sure.
Wolff points to the growth of the Chinese economy as a major sign of this power shift.
Okay.
He claims China's GDP has been growing way faster than the U.S. for decades.
Yeah.
He even throws out numbers China at 6 to 9% growth annually
Wow.
versus the U.S. at a measly 2 to 3%.
Uh-huh.
But does that automatically mean the U.S. is doomed?
Well, it's certainly a sign that things are changing.
Okay.
That kind of sustained difference in growth rates over decades
Yeah.
has allowed China to become a serious economic competitor.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it.
Yeah.
When was the last time the U.S. faced a rival like this?
That's a good point.
Yeah.
And Wolff uses this pretty wild analogy
Oh, yeah.
to describe how the U.S. is reacting to all of this.
Okay.
He compares the U.S. to a toddler hiding from a barking dog.
Oh, wow.
I mean, ouch.
Yeah.
Is he saying we're just burying our heads in the sand?
That's a good question. I think the analogy suggests a level of denial,
Okay.
maybe even a refusal to acknowledge that the world is changing
Right.
and that the U.S. might not be the unchallenged superpower it once was.
So how did we get to this point where the U.S. might be losing its grip?
Right.
Wolff takes us back in time to the New Deal era
Okay.
and contrasts it with the policies that followed something called neoliberalism.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm not an economist, so what is neoliberalism exactly? And how
Yeah.
does it tie into all of this?
Okay, think of it this way.
Yeah.
The New Deal, back in the 1930s, was all about government stepping in to help the economy and protect workers.
Yeah.
There were social safety nets, higher taxes on corporations and the wealthy,
Right.
things like that.
Right.
Neoliberalism, which gained traction in the 70s, takes a completely different approach.
Yeah.
It's all about deregulation, free trade,
Okay.
and basically shrinking the government's role in the economy.
Okay, I'm starting to see the connection here.
Yeah.
So is Wolff saying that this shift towards neoliberalism actually helped China rise at the expense of the U.S.?
That's a key part of his argument.
Okay.
He points out that as the U.S. embraced policies like deregulation and corporate tax cuts,
Right.
American companies started looking overseas for cheaper labor and bigger profits.
Oh, yeah.
Where did they go? China.
Mhm.
And guess what? Those same neoliberal policies that were supposed to boost American capitalism
Right.
actually ended up fueling the growth of its biggest competitor.
So wait a minute.
Yeah.
Are you saying we kind of shot ourselves in the foot?
It's possible.
We helped create the conditions for our own economic decline.
It's certainly a provocative argument.
Yeah.
And it raises some important questions about the long-term consequences
Right.
of prioritizing short-term corporate profits.
Yeah.
Maybe we need to rethink the balance between free markets and government intervention.
Okay, this is getting pretty heavy.
Yeah.
But what does all this actually mean for everyday people like you and me?
Right.
I mean, how does the decline of the American empire, if that's even happening, affect our lives?
Well, Wolff argues that the costs of this decline are not being shared equally.
Okay.
In fact, he claims that everyday Americans are bearing the brunt of it.
What does that look like? Give me
Yeah.
some concrete examples.
Think about things like stagnant wages,
Okay.
where your paycheck doesn't seem to go as far as it used to.
Right.
Or the fact that the federal minimum wage hasn't been raised in over a decade.
Oh, wow.
Wolff argues that these are signs that the economic pie might be growing, but the slices are getting smaller for working people.
He even connects this economic anxiety to the political climate, right?
Yes.
He brings up Trump's victory
Yeah.
and suggests it was fueled, at least in part,
Yeah,
by people feeling left behind economically.
that's right.
Okay.
Wolff argues that these anxieties and frustrations
Right.
can create a breeding ground for populism and political polarization.
Yeah.
People are looking for someone to blame for their economic struggles,
Right.
and that can lead to some pretty unpredictable outcomes.
But hold on.
Yeah.
If taxing corporations and the wealthy was such a bad idea, How did FDR, who enacted those very policies during the New Deal,
Right.
become one of the most popular presidents in history?
That's a great point, and Wolff uses it to challenge the assumption that taxing the wealthy is inherently unpopular.
Right.
He argues that in times of crisis,
Yeah.
people might actually be more receptive to such measures if they believe they're fair and necessary to address shared economic challenges.
So if the U.S. is potentially on the decline
Right.
and China's on the rise, what's next?
That's the question.
I mean, are we heading for some kind of showdown,
Yeah.
like a new Cold War?
Right.
Or is there a chance for cooperation?
Right.
Wolff touches on this too, right?
He does.
What does he say about the relationship between the U.S. and China going forward?
Well, he certainly expresses concerns about the potential for conflict.
Okay.
He even draws parallels to historical examples like the American Revolution,
Right.
suggesting that the U.S. might struggle to accept a world where it's not the dominant power.
But he doesn't rule out the possibility of a more peaceful outcome, does he?
No, he doesn't.
Okay.
He does point out that the U.S. and Britain eventually developed a working relationship
Right.
after the American Revolution.
Yeah.
So maybe there's hope for something similar with China.
Okay.
But he stresses that this requires the U.S. to move beyond denial and engage in honest conversations about the future.
So we've got a lot to think about here.
We do.
The potential decline of the American empire, the rise of China,
Yeah.
the impact on everyday Americans.
Right.
It's heavy stuff.
It is. And it's not just China we need to consider.
Oh, right.
Wolff emphasizes the growing role of the BRICS nations. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa.
Right. I remember him mentioning that. He
Yeah.
talked about how China's been actively building alliances, especially with the BRICS countries.
Yeah,
And I think he even said more countries have joined that group recently.
that's right.
What's the big deal about the BRICS anyway? Why should we care?
Well, for starters, they represent a massive chunk of the global population and economic output.
Okay.
Their influence is growing,
Right.
and they're starting to challenge the dominance of the U.S.
Yeah.
and those traditional powerhouses like the G7.
Okay, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
It's like a whole new world order is emerging with different players and different rules.
Exactly.
But let's bring this back down to earth for a second.
Sure.
How does all of this, the rise of China, the BRICS, the potential decline of the U.S.,
Right.
how does it actually affect the average person listening right now?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Wolff argues that if we keep ignoring these shifts,
Okay.
the consequences could be pretty serious.
Oh, wow.
He suggests the U.S. might be repeating the mistakes of past empires
Right.
that failed to adapt to a changing world.
He even mentions the possibility of war, right?
He does.
I think he compared the tension between the U.S. and China
Yeah.
to the events leading up to the American Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
That's a scary thought.
It is a sobering comparison.
Yeah.
He's suggesting that if the U.S. tries to hold on to its dominance at all costs,
Right.
it could lead to a dangerous escalation of tensions.
But it's not like war is inevitable, is it?
Right.
I mean, Wolff also talked about how the U.S. and Britain eventually worked things out after the American Revolution.
Yeah.
Could something similar happen with China?
It's possible.
Is there a path toward cooperation?
He does offer that glimmer of hope,
Yeah.
suggesting that peaceful coexistence is possible.
Right.
But it requires both sides to recognize the changing power dynamics
Yeah.
and be willing to negotiate a new global order.
So are we at some kind of crossroads here?
It seems like it.
Do we cling to the past and risk conflict,
Mm-hmm.
or embrace this new reality and try to build a more cooperative future?
That's the choice we face.
Yeah.
And Wolff is urging us to have honest conversations about it.
Okay.
He's challenging us to confront these complex realities head on
Right.
and make informed decisions about the path we take as a nation.
One thing that really struck me
Yeah.
was Wolff's argument that the U.S. is essentially offloading the costs of its decline
Right.
onto everyday Americans.
Yeah.
I mean, what does he mean by that?
Yeah, what does he mean by it?
Who's paying the price for all of this?
He's saying that instead of sharing the burden of this economic transition fairly,
Okay.
the wealthy and powerful are protecting themselves,
Right.
while the middle and lower classes are left to deal with the consequences.
So it's like a double whammy.
Yeah.
The U.S. is potentially losing its global standing,
Right.
and everyday Americans are getting squeezed in the process.
Mm-hmm.
What are some specific examples of how that's happening?
Well, he uses those stark examples of stagnant wages
Okay.
and the fact that the federal minimum wage hasn't budged in over a decade.
Right.
He's suggesting that those in power are turning a blind eye
Yeah.
to the struggles of those who are most vulnerable to these economic shifts.
And we're already seeing the fallout from that, right?
They think so.
I mean, Wolff even connects this economic anxiety to the rise of figures like Trump.
Yeah.
Is he saying that this kind of political upheaval is a direct result of these economic problems?
He argues that the deep frustration with things like stagnant wages and rising inequality contributed to a sense of anger and resentment that fueled Trump's victory.
Yeah.
And it's not just a U.S. phenomenon. It's happening globally.
Yeah.
Think about all the populist movements gaining traction around the world.
It's like a pressure cooker, isn't it?
Yeah.
All this economic pressure building up and threatening to boil over.
Right.
So what's the solution? What does Wolff propose we do about all of this?
He doesn't offer a step-by-step plan in this particular segment,
Okay.
but his analysis strongly suggests a need for a fundamental change.
Right.
He seems to advocate for moving away from those neoliberal policies that prioritize corporate profits over the well-being of workers.
So less focus on profits, more focus on people.
That seems to be the direction he's pointing us in.
Okay.
Talks about the need for a system that prioritizes shared prosperity and economic justice.
He specifically mentions raising the minimum wage.
Yes.
And addressing the problem of stagnant wages. Right.
Right.
And he also brings up the example of FDR and how his policies, which included taxing the wealthy, were actually pretty popular.
Yeah.
Is he suggesting we go back to that kind of approach?
He's definitely challenging the idea that taxing the wealthy is inherently unpopular.
Right.
He's arguing that if people see those policies as fair and aimed at creating a more just society, they can gain widespread support.
So we need to have these honest conversations about how we distribute wealth and create a more equitable system.
Yes.
But let's be real, we're so divided as a nation right now.
We are.
How do we even begin to have those conversations in a productive way?
Right.
How do we bridge that divide?
That's the challenge, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I think Wolff is suggesting that the first step is acknowledging the reality of the situation.
Okay.
We can't solve problems that we refuse to see.
So step one, stop pretending everything's fine.
Yeah.
And start facing the music.
Right.
Then what?
Yeah.
What comes after that?
Then we can start having those difficult but necessary conversations about how we create a more just and sustainable future.
Okay.
He's calling for a collective process of reflection and action.
He's essentially saying we can't just sit back and watch the world change around us.
Right.
We need to be active participants in shaping that change.
Exactly.
But how do we do that?
Right.
What can we actually do as individuals to navigate this shifting landscape? I mean, it feels like these global forces are so much bigger than us.
It can feel that way.
Yeah.
But Wolff believes that we have more power than we realize.
Okay.
He encourages us to educate ourselves,
Right.
stay informed about these global shifts, and engage in thoughtful discussions about how we can adapt and thrive in this new reality.
So knowledge is power.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And with knowledge comes the ability to make informed choices,
Right.
to advocate for change,
Yeah.
and to hold our leaders accountable.
He's basically calling for a shift in mindset, right?
I think so.
A recognition that the world is more complex than it used to be.
He's urging us to embrace that complexity, to question assumptions, and to be open to new ways of thinking about global power and economics.
And most importantly, to take action.
Right.
To not just sit back and be passive observers.
Yeah.
But to actually try to shape the world we want to live in. So it feels like we've been talking about some pretty abstract concepts.
Yeah.
Empires, economic systems, global power dynamics.
Right.
But there's one really concrete example that Wolff uses to illustrate his points. The war in Ukraine.
Right.
How does that conflict fit into all of this?
He sees the war in Ukraine as a symptom of this shifting global landscape.
Okay.
A sign that the old world order is breaking down.
Right.
He argues that the West, particularly the U.S., made some serious miscalculations about Russia's strength and resolve.
Okay.
Largely due to that denial we talked about earlier. Remember that toddler hiding from the barking dog?
Yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
He's saying we were so focused on our own narrative, our own view of the world, that we missed some pretty important signals.
Exactly.
Right.
Think about all the predictions at the beginning of the war, that Russia's economy would collapse, that they'd be isolated on the world stage.
Yeah.
Those predictions turned out to be way off the mark.
And Wolff attributes that to a failure to understand how the world has changed, right?
Yeah. He's saying we underestimated the influence of China and the BRICS nations.
Okay.
And how they might support Russia.
He sees the war in Ukraine as a wake-up call then.
I think so.
A sign that the U.S. can no longer dictate the terms of global engagement.
Right.
We're now in a multipolar world.
Yeah.
Where other players have a say.
Exactly.
It's like we're trying to play the same old game. But the rules have changed, and we didn't even realize it.
And as Wolff points out,
yeah,
clinging to outdated strategies can have disastrous consequences.
So where do we go from here? What can we as individuals do to navigate this incredibly complex and shifting world? I mean, it feels overwhelming sometimes.
Wolff doesn't offer simple solutions, but he does challenge us to confront these realities head on.
Right.
He encourages us to move beyond denial, to engage in honest conversations about the kind of future we want to build.
He's calling for a real shift in our mindset then.
Yeah, a recognition that the world is no longer as predictable or as simple as it once seemed. He's urging us to embrace complexity, to question our assumptions, to be open to new ways of thinking about global power and economics.
So it's not about burying our heads in the sand. It's about becoming more informed, more engaged, more willing to learn and adapt.
Absolutely.
And perhaps most importantly, it's about being willing to challenge the status quo and advocate for policies that promote a more just and sustainable world.
I agree.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. From the potential decline of the American empire to the rise of China, the emergence of the BRICS nations, and the implications for everyday Americans. It's a lot to process.
It is.
What are your final thoughts?
Well, Wolff's analysis is definitely thought-provoking. He pushes us to think critically about the world around us, to question our assumptions, and to consider different perspectives. Understanding these trends is crucial if we want to navigate the future effectively and create a world that works for everyone.
It's a call to action for all of us.
It is.
To stay informed, to engage in meaningful conversations, and to be active participants in shaping the future we want.
I agree.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Richard Wolff's analysis.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope you found it insightful.
I hope so too.
Keep exploring these ideas.
Yes.
And let's continue the conversation.